So I'm going to talk to you about literary translation theories in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, and the way in which these theories actually, or the way that they were written, pushed the boundaries of what could be said about translation during a particular period of Soviet history. I should mention at the start that I'm doing an experiment into using colour for the backgrounds, so you can let me know afterwards whether you think it works or not. So I'm going to talk mainly about two translation theorists, literary translation theorists, Kornei Chukovskii in green there, and Efim Etkind on the right in blue. And I've also put Kashkin there because in many ways, the way that Chukovskii and Etkind were writing in the 1960s was in opposition to Ivan Kashkin. Now, he had been the person who, in the 1930s, produced a version of Socialist Realism, this particular style of art and literature, for translation, an approach to translation which was driven by Socialist Realism, which really meant translating as if the author, the original author, had been a Soviet. And it's a particular type of domestication for the Soviet context. And it was very ideologically driven. And Kornei Chukovskii, who had begun writing about translation just after the revolution in 1919, and we can see that he's from a quite different generation from their date to Efim Etkind. Kornei Chukovskii had really been the first person in the Soviet Union in that era to write about translation. And he had been encouraged by Gorky, who had a literary translation project called World Literature, to translate works of important world literature into Russian. And he asked Chukovskii to write some guidelines for literary translators, particularly young translators. And so that's how he had got into this. And so in his first version then was in 1919, but he went through his work called at some point Art of Translation, went through many different editions until 1968, the year before his death. And so I'm going to be talking about the 1960s editions of his work. And Etkind produced his monograph in 1963, which was about poetry translation. So looking at Chukovskii first, and you can see the incredible longevity of his writing, of his work as a theorist of translation, writing on it right from 1919 to 1968, with sort of pauses between, and then he would revise it again and make it fit the new era. But his main work was, he was really mainly known as a children's author. And so translation theory is a side interest of his. So as I said, he got into writing about translation for Gorky, writing this section of a pamphlet in 1919, which was about prose translation. Gorky asked somebody else called Gumilyov to write about poetry translation. This was in 1919, and then 2 or 3 years later, Gorky was executed. Sorry, not Gorky. Gumilyov was executed, and so after that, Chukovskii could never mention again, not until the 1960s at any rate, that he had written together with Gumilyov, because Gumilyov's name could not be mentioned after that. So an important thing that Chukovskii did was to identify the important features of any translation, what needs to be conveyed in any translation, such as the lexis, the style, the rhythm, the sound patterns, the melody, the syntax, the intonation of the original. And this list of, this taxonomy of features of a translation that he identifies is something that later writers, including Kashkin, including Etkind, then build on. Also his method, the fact that he criticized existing translations, was also influential. People who came after him, such as Kashkin and Etkind, used that same technique. Interestingly, what Chukovskii liked in a literary translation was it should be exciting and interesting to read. He liked a free translation, he didn't like to be bored. What he really did not like was literal translations, word-for-word translations. And in that, he echoed Kashkin, who spent a lot of time criticizing the literal translations of Yevgeny Lan, in particular, in the 1920s. And that's something which Chukovsky had then picked up on and went on as well, even though, in fact, Chukovsky, in his early work, had been a literalist himself. But his more mature work is to say that he liked quite a free translation. And within his own book, he models exciting prose. It's a popularist work on translation. So what we should really note is how Chukovsky's life affected how he wrote about translation in the 1960s. So in the 1920s, Chukovsky was sort of savagely attacked by Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, but he managed to survive that. He did not suffer repression at that point. Then in the late 1930s, Chukovsky's son-in-law disappeared, and it turned out that he'd been executed. This was obviously very close to home. There were then articles in Pravda, the major newspaper, against Chukovsky. I think that was during the 1940s, but he again survived that. And in the 1960s, he was again vulnerable because his daughter, Lydia, was involved with the sort of proto-dissident movements, people who were rather critical of the regime. He became himself friends, well, he'd been for a long time he'd been friends with Pasternak. He also became friends with Solzhenitsyn, and who stayed with him for some time. And so you can see a development in his own political position, and how we'll see how this can show up in his translation theory, his work on translation. If we turn now to Etkind, he was then applying those aspects of translation that I mentioned, that Chukovsky had drawn up. He was applying that to poetry translation. And initially he had been, he was extremely good at French and German. From childhood, he'd used French at home and German at school. And his main work to start with was in literature. He sort of identifying elements of style in different languages, and that brought him into translation. And this was then comparative stylistics of poetry. And his main point was that there should be a unity of form and content in a poetry translation. And this is something that comes from the Russian Formalists of the 1920s, under whom Etkind had in fact studied at that time. And this was an important thing which he carried on in his academic career. We see something similar in Fyodorov, who is a different theorist of the times that I'm not going to talk about today. So what Etkind liked in a literary translation was rather different to Chukovsky's. What he wanted was a real fundamental understanding of the culture, the literary style of the languages in question for a translation. He thought that there was no sort of key. Chukovsky had suggested that there was maybe a key that could simplify things, but Etkind didn't believe that. He thought that there was no replacement for hard graft to really understand the different languages and literatures in question. And in particular, he praised the translations of Mikhail Lozinski, who had translated, it's gone out of my head, Dante, wasn't it? Lozinski had made folders and folders of in-depth research into Dante and the period and the type of literary style, and Etkind particularly praised him for this. So he thought there was no excuse for this hard research. And we see that Etkind's work on translation theory is affected by his life experience, his treatment by the authorities. Although he had served in the army during World War II, using his German as an interpreter, he nonetheless suffered then in the anti-Semitic campaign, the anti-cosmopolitan campaign of 1948. He was exiled to the provinces, leaving his academic career in Leningrad, as it was called by then. And he was not able to resume his career until a few years later. And he associated in Leningrad with people who had returned from the camps, such as Tatiana Gnedich, who a poetry translator who we'll talk about in a moment more. She had returned from the camps, and she and Etkind ran translation workshops for young poetry translators. This affected the way that his interests and how he then wrote out translation. So what we see in terms of how Etkind, who's now on the left, and Chukovskii on the right on a stamp, how they pushed the boundaries of what you could say in translation during the 1960s, is that there's then this mutual influence of writing about translation, literary translation, and writing about politics. And it's not as though they're writing about politics through writing about literary translation, it's just all one. You can see that, for example, in the way that Etkind didn't pay lip service to Marx and Engels and Lenin like other people did, including Chukovskii and most particularly Kashkin. He wrote an statement. He didn't even use the word Soviet. He would sometimes say our, but he wrote as if he was writing anywhere in the world, I suppose. And so he spent quite a bit of time in this monograph in 1963 talking about the work of the podvig, the feat of Tatiana Gnedich in translating from memory while she was in a camp, and praising her work. And Chukovskii then sort of lifts this whole section wholesale and adds that into 1960s versions. There was 1964, 66, 68, I think. He's then, in those versions, he's using the text by Etkind, and adapting it slightly and talking about Gnedich. So what we see there is that both Etkind and Chukovskii are associating themselves, identifying themselves with a former political prisoner, which is quite a political statement in itself. Etkind also praises the work of Boris Pasternak, who Peter van Pulka talked to us about earlier today, that these are very free translations, very popular translations. And Etkind wrote about those. And by the time that he's writing about Pasternak and he's writing about translations of Heinrich Heine, we see that cumulatively he's mentioning Jewish authors and Jewish translators more than might have been seemly at the time, given that he's Jewish himself. Yes, Chukovskii, who was friends with Pasternak, I also mentioned him to an extent, but Chukovskii particularly, in his final version, the 1968 version of his book, he wanted to write about translations of Solzhenitsyn to English and Italian. And he held out for quite some time because the censor would not let that happen. The editors spotted it and knew that could not be written about. By that point, it was moving in. This is now 1968. It's just after the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and at that point, Brezhnev is wanting to make his mark, and things can no longer be said. They could be said even just 5 years earlier. When Khrushchev was still sort of having this tentative thaw period. And so Chukovskii tried to include these pages where he talks about Solzhenitsyn translations of Solzhenitsyn, and he finally realised that it wasn't going to be possible, that the censor was just not going to let it. And though he said he would take out that section, and in his diary we see that he reproaches himself for wanting to see his book republished more than he wanted to have this section by Solzhenitsyn included. But in the post-Soviet editions, we can see this section included again. So to sum up, what we see in the 1960s version of Chukovskii, now on the left and Etkind now on the right, of their work on translation, literary translation theory, is this sort of proto-dissidence. This is before there were real, you could talk really of dissidents that came perhaps in the 1970s. But there's this sort of, there are these hints of dissidents working themselves out. The start of this opposition, a very tentative opposition to the regime. And Chukovskii tried too late, really, in 1968 to get this section on Solzhenitsyn included in his literary theory, because he then died in 1969, and the tide had turned anyway under Brezhnev. Etkind, meanwhile, what the hints that you can see in his work in 1963, it increased. He became labelled as a troublemaker, as a dissident, perhaps even before he knew it himself. And his support for Brodsky in particular meant that he ended up going into external exile, well, being expelled from the country as he had previously been in internal exile in the 1940s. And so I think it's fascinating to see that in their work on literary translation, we can see this proto-dissidence. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for your speech. We do have a few minutes for the discussion. Are there any questions from the audience? No questions at all? Well, it was really a very interesting session with different talks that involved ideological or political elements in the translation process.